There are places in the world where winter does not feel like mere seasons. There, winter becomes an entire world, a world that is white, silent, and harsh. High up in the mountains, where the peaks rise above the clouds, the snow would begin to accumulate with the very first days of winter. And then it would not stop. It covers the rocks. It covers the trees. It covers the ancient paths that the shepherds used to traverse during the summer. And after a few weeks, it becomes difficult for a stranger to tell where the road ends and where the abyss begins. The winds would blow across the mountains all day long. At times, they would slip into the narrow crevices of the rocks, emerging with a long, moaning sound. As for the night, the mountain would seem like an entirely different place. No lights, no human sounds, nothing except the black sky, the snow, and the wind. In this place lived a shepherd who, for years, had made a habit of spending the winter with his flock in these mountains. He did not own much: a small house at the foot of the mountain, a few sheep, 3 dogs, and an old wooden staff that had practically become a part of his hand. He knew the mountain as well as he knew his own home. He knew the rocks that could be dangerous. He knew the places where the snow gathered. He knew the paths that could be crossed safely. And he also knew that no matter how well a person knew it, the mountain remained stronger than them. He knew his sheep one by one. To him, they were not just a flock. He knew which ones were calmer, which ones were constantly moving, and which ones were quick to frighten. He knew the little lambs by the way they walked. Even the 3 dogs each had a different role. The oldest dog would move ahead of the flock, then circle back to make sure no sheep had strayed. The black and white dog was more active, constantly running to the right and left. The younger gray dog would spend a long time sniffing the ground, the snow, and the rocks. The dogs did not need many commands. Over the years, they had learned how to read the flock, when to push them forward, when to stop, and when they needed to pay attention. On a winter day, the shepherd woke up before dawn. The room was dark, and the cold had crept inside despite the closed windows. He lingered for a moment beneath the blanket. Then he reached out his hand toward his clothes. The clothes were cold to the point that made him hesitate for a moment before putting them on. Yet he knew he had to go out. He sat on the edge of his bed. He put on the thick shirt, then the woolen sweater, then the heavy coat. He wrapped a piece of wool around his neck, covered his ears, and finally put on his boots. He stood up, took his staff, then prepared his small bag. In it, he placed some bread, a little salt, a handful of dried herbs, and a few simple things he would need to spend the night on the mountain. He did not yet know that he would need everything he was carrying when he opened the door of the house. The cold air rushed into the room. It felt like a slap to the face. The shepherd shrugged his shoulders and took a short breath. A puff of white steam escaped before his face. He raised his eyes to the sky. The morning was still dark. The village was quiet. The roofs of the houses were covered in snow, and from a few chimneys, faint smoke was rising. In the distance, he heard the bark of a dog. Then the silence returned. The flock was waiting for him. As he approached, the sheep began to stir. Some of them raised their heads. Others emitted faint sounds. The little lambs drew closer to their mothers. The shepherd cleared the path. The sheep moved out from their shelter. Then the dogs came out. The big dog was the first to step forward. He stopped for a moment, raised his head, sniffed the air, and then began to walk. The flock moved behind him, and the shepherd was in the lead. At first, The snow was low. Their feet passed over it easily, but the higher they climbed, things began to change. The sheep's feet would sink into the snow, then pull out, then sink in again. The little lambs began to tire. Some of them would quickly lift a leg when the snow clung to their hooves. The shepherd walked slowly, striking his staff against the ground before every step, not because he did not know the way, rather because he wanted to be certain of the ground beneath the snow. For the mountains do not only hide rocks, they also hide pits and crevices, and sometimes there might be a deep hole beneath a layer of snow that looked like solid ground. After an hour of climbing, the cold grew harsher. The air slipped through the edges of his clothes. He began to feel the chill in his fingertips. He rubbed them inside his gloves, then switched the staff from one hand to the other. He was breathing with greater difficulty. Every breath entering his chest was cold, and every exhale turned into vapor. The snow began to cling to his eyelashes, and when the wind blew, he was forced to lower his head, then continue. A step, then another. Behind him, the sheep moved in a long line, and the dogs circled around them. There was nothing else. No cars, no human sounds, no houses, only the mountain. Then the wind changed. It began to intensify. At first, it came in sporadic gusts. Then it grew stronger. It carried particles of snow and lashed them against their faces. The shepherd raised the cloth over his face. He could no longer see very far. The clouds began to drop. The peaks vanished, and the mountain he knew so well began to turn into a boundless white expanse. He looked back. He saw the flock. The sheep huddled close together, the lambs in the middle, and the dogs moving around them. He had to find a place to shelter before nightfall, and he knew of one place that could offer that. An old cave among the rocks, a cave the shepherds had used for years. He began to urge the flock forward. He knew they had to reach it before the storm worsened further. And as he walked, he did not know that this journey would bring back a memory he had buried deep within himself for a full year. The memory of a single sheep, a sheep that had vanished among these mountains, a sheep that had fallen one day among the rocks, then disappeared. They never found its body. They never found its tracks, and no one knew where it ended up. Everyone said it had died, and perhaps the wolves had eaten it. Yet the shepherd had never completely forgotten it. Whenever he passed through the area where it had vanished, he would glance at it for moments, then continue on his way. And that winter, he was about to pass through that exact same place once more. Only this time, he did not know that the mountain which had taken his sheep a year ago was hiding a surprise for him that no one could have anticipated. A surprise that would reveal itself just a few hours later, inside a dark cave, in the middle of the night. A full year earlier, and in a winter much like this one, the shepherd was walking along almost the same path, but the snow that day was lighter, the sky was overcast, and the wind was cold, though visibility was much better. The flock moved slowly between the rocks. The sheep followed one another, the young lambs staying close to their mothers, while the three dogs moved around the flock, sometimes ahead, sometimes returning to the rear, and sometimes running along the sides to keep any sheep from wandering away. As for the shepherd, he walked at the front, holding his wooden staff. It was an ordinary day, or so it seemed to him. He had no idea that this day would remain in his memory for an entire year. Halfway along the path, the shepherd stopped for a moment. He turned around. He was accustomed to counting the sheep, Not because he didn't trust the flock, but because a good shepherd knew that the disappearance of a single sheep could turn into a serious problem within minutes. He began counting. 1, 2, 3. He continued until he reached the end of the flock. Then he counted them again. He stopped. Something was missing. One sheep. It wasn't there. He raised his head and looked over the flock again. Perhaps it was behind one of the rocks. Perhaps it had fallen behind. Perhaps it was hiding among the trees. He waited for a while, but it didn't appear. He called for it. There was no response. He called again, louder. He waited. Then, a distant sound reached him, a faint bleat. The shepherd stopped moving. He raised his head. He listened carefully. The sound was coming from a low area behind a group of rocks. He called again. The bleat came from the same place. It was there, but he didn't know exactly where. The shepherd signaled to the dogs to stay with the flock. Then he began moving toward the sound. He had to descend slightly between the rocks. Every step became more difficult. Snow covered the ground. The rocks were slippery from the moisture. He placed his staff in front of him, testing the ground before shifting his weight onto his foot. He moved slowly. Then he heard the sound again. This time, it was closer. Baa. He looked between the rocks. At first, he saw nothing. Then he noticed a small movement. He moved closer, and there she was. The sheep was trapped in a narrow space between two rocks. She hadn't fallen into a deep pit, but she had slipped in a way that left her body wedged between the rocks. She tried to move. Every time she lifted one of her legs, she slipped again. She was frightened. Her eyes darted from side to side, and when she saw the shepherd, she began bleating louder. He moved toward her. He reached out his hand. But the distance was greater than he had expected. He needed to climb down farther. He placed one foot on a rock, then another. He tested the spot with his staff. The rock seemed stable. He took one step. Then suddenly, his foot slipped. He lost his balance for a moment. He quickly reached out and grabbed a nearby rock. He remained completely still for several seconds. He looked down at the slope beneath him. A fall from that height could have left him seriously injured. He raised his head toward the sheep. She was looking at him, as if she were waiting for him to save her. The shepherd thought about the rope he had with him. If he could reach her, perhaps he could tie it around her and pull her free. But the problem wasn't the rope. The problem was getting to her. The slope was dangerous, and the snow had begun to fall. At first, there were only a few flakes. Then they became heavier. He looked at the sky, then at the sheep. He knew that if he stayed there much longer, he might become the one who needed rescuing. He moved as close as he could. He reached out his hand again, but he still couldn't reach her. He spoke to her softly. "Don't be afraid." The sheep was trembling. He moved a little closer, then stepped back. He had to return to the village. He would tell the men, then come back with ropes and equipment. He thought it would take only an hour or two. He had no idea that those hours would be the last time he ever saw her. He returned to the flock, then began descending. But every few steps he turned around. Sometimes he could still hear the sheep. A distant bleat, then silence, then another bleat. Every time he heard her, he felt a sharp pain in his chest. He wanted to turn back immediately, but first he had to reach the village. The weather was changing quickly, and he had the flock with him. He reached the village in the evening. Darkness had begun to fall. His hands were freezing, and his clothes were covered in snow. He told the men what had happened. He described where the sheep was and where she had been trapped. They agreed to return in the morning. They prepared ropes, sticks, and some tools. The shepherd was certain she would still be there when they returned. But the night was harsher than they had expected. The storm came. Snow fell throughout the night, and the winds continued to batter the mountain. When they went out in the morning, the path was different. Their old footprints had disappeared. The trails they had followed the day before were buried beneath a fresh layer of snow. Even the rocks were no longer clearly visible. They had to find the path all over again. Eventually, they reached the place. The shepherd stopped. He looked at the rocks, then called for her. Once, no answer. He called again, louder. Nothing. He approached the place where she had been. The snow had covered much of it. They began digging. They cleared the snow with their hands and sticks. They searched between the rocks. They looked beneath the edges. They searched the slope, but they found nothing. No sheep, no body, not even a clear trace showing where she might have gone. Only snow, rocks, and silence. The shepherd began searching more desperately. He moved away from the spot, descended the slope, then climbed back up from another direction. He searched behind the rocks, under the ledges. Inside the cracks, he cleared the snow with his bare hands, and every time he thought he had found something, it turned out to be nothing more than a rock or a piece of wood. After hours, the exhaustion began to show on his face. One of the men told him they might never find anything, but the shepherd said nothing. He continued searching. He called for her, then waited. He hoped to hear a bleat, any sound. Anything, but the mountain remained silent. In the end, they had to return. People in the village began to speculate. Perhaps she had fallen into a deep crevice. Perhaps she had died from the cold. Perhaps wolves had reached her. Or perhaps an avalanche had carried her somewhere else. There was no evidence of anything. But in the mountains, when an animal disappears and you find no trace of it, people tend to assume the worst. The shepherd returned home. That night, he couldn't sleep easily. He could hear the wind outside the window, and every time he heard a sound that resembled a sheep's bleat, he opened his eyes, then remembered that she wasn't there. Days passed, then weeks. With every new storm, more snow covered the place. No one talked about her anymore. Then spring arrived. The snow melted, the rocks appeared, the grass returned, and the shepherds went back into the mountains. The shepherd returned to the area where she had disappeared. He searched again. He wanted to find anything, a bone, a piece of wool, any trace, but he found nothing. And the absence of any trace was what stayed in his mind the most. If wolves had eaten her, perhaps something would have remained. If she had died from the cold, perhaps her body would still have been there. If she had fallen into a deep place, perhaps they would have found something indicating what had happened. But there was nothing, as if the mountain had swallowed her completely. Summer passed, then autumn, and winter began again. With the first snowfall, the shepherd returned to the mountain. The flock was ahead of him. The dogs moved around it. And that old memory was walking beside him without him even realizing it. Whenever he approached the area where the sheep had disappeared, he slowed his steps, looked at the rocks, then continued. He had convinced himself that it was over, that she had died, and that the mountain had hidden what remained of her. There was no reason to believe otherwise. But that winter, something happened that no one could have anticipated. One day, as the shepherd climbed with the flock, the storm began to intensify. Snow fell rapidly, the fog descended, and visibility became worse. He could no longer continue safely. He had to find somewhere to take shelter before nightfall, and he knew of only one place where he could do that: an old cave between the rocks. He led the flock toward it. He had no idea that night would change everything he believed about the missing sheep. He didn't know that a sound would come from the darkness, a sound that would make him wonder for a few moments whether he was hearing something real, or whether his own memory was playing tricks on him. And he didn't know that the sheep he had left between those rocks a year earlier was closer to him than he could ever imagine. And perhaps she had been watching the very same mountain that had been watching her for an entire year. The day was beginning to draw to an end when the shepherd realized that staying outside was no longer safe. They had been climbing for hours, and with every meter the mountain became harsher. The snow was getting deeper, and the wind was no longer coming in scattered gusts. It was blowing continuously, pushing the snow ahead of it, as if sweeping across the surface of the mountain. The shepherd walked at the front, but he could no longer see the path clearly. Everything ahead of him was white and gray. The nearby rocks were barely visible through the fog, and the peaks that had been clear at the beginning of the day had completely disappeared. Even the sound of the flock had changed. The sheep were no longer moving calmly. They pressed close to one another as they walked, each one trying to stay near the others. The young lambs were beginning to tire. Some would stop for a few seconds, then continue walking when one of the dogs gently nudged them forward. As for the three dogs, they were moving more than usual. The large dog would move slightly ahead, then return to the flock. The black and white dog ran along the sides, and the gray dog would stop from time to time, raise its nose toward the air, then continue. The shepherd watched them, for in the mountains, sometimes the dogs are the first to know that the weather is about to change. The shepherd raised his head. He knew the cave was nearby, but in weather like this, the word nearby didn't mean much. The place could be 10 minutes away, or it could take a full hour to reach. He continued walking. He struck his staff into the snow, then moved forward, once, then again, then a third time. He wanted to make sure the ground beneath his feet was solid. Some places that looked flat were hiding sharp rocks beneath them. Others concealed small gaps between the rocks. And if one of the sheep fell into one of them, it could take a long time to get it out. The wind began striking his face directly. He lowered his head, pulled the fabric tighter around his mouth. He could hear the sound of his own breathing inside the cloth. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. With every exhale, vapor gathered for a moment before disappearing. He began to feel the tips of his fingers losing some of their sensation. He moved his fingers inside his gloves, opened his hand, closed it, opened it again. He didn't want to let the cold take control of his hands. He knew that cold hands gradually lost their ability to grip the staff. And the staff in this place wasn't just a piece of wood. It was his balance, his second set of eyes, and his way of knowing what lay beneath the snow. Then he saw something. At first he thought it was a rock, a dark shape against the white. He stopped, raised his hand. The dogs stopped. Then the sheep began gathering together. The shepherd moved forward a few steps. The rock became clearer. Then, behind it, a dark opening appeared. The cave, at last. The entrance was low and narrow. Part of it was hidden behind a large rock, and snow had piled up around the entrance. There was still enough space to enter. The large dog approached first. It stood at the entrance, put its head inside, smelled the air, then entered. The shepherd waited for a few moments. He heard no barking, which most likely meant the place was empty. He signaled to the other dogs. They entered. Then he turned toward the flock. The sheep began entering one by one. Some hesitated at the entrance. They didn't want to leave the open air. But as soon as they entered, they felt the wind become weaker. Several sheep stopped, raised their heads, and began breathing more calmly. The cave was deeper than it appeared from outside. It wasn't very large, but it was large enough to provide shelter. The walls were rough stone. Some areas were damp. Dark spots caused by moisture appeared across the ceiling. Frozen water hung from some of the edges like tiny strands of glass. The ground was a mixture of dry soil, gravel, and some remains of straw. There were old traces of fires lit by other shepherds, black marks on the rocks, old ashes, and several pieces of charred wood. The shepherd approached the wall, ran his hand over it, then looked at the old fire pit. He chose an area relatively protected from the wind. If he lit the fire near the entrance, the wind would consume it. And if he lit it in a completely enclosed area, the smoke would gather. So he chose a place somewhere between the two. He began searching for firewood. He had collected a few pieces along the way, but they weren't enough. He looked around. He found some dry branches sheltered beneath a rocky overhang. He pulled them out one by one. Some of the branches were damp on the outside, but their centers were still dry. He broke one. A sharp crack echoed through the cave. He placed the smaller pieces to one side, then gathered some bark. He arranged it on the ground, placed the thin branches over it, then added the larger pieces. He didn't want a huge fire. He wanted a fire that would last. A fire that could survive for hours. He lit a small piece of wood. At first, nothing happened. Gray smoke appeared, then more smoke. The shepherd blew on it, waited, blew again. A small flame appeared. It rose, then fell. He leaned closer and blew a third time. The bark caught fire, then the small branches caught. Orange light began appearing across the rocks, and suddenly, the cave became less frightening. Fire changed the place. Before it, the cave was nothing more than a dark space. Afterward, it had boundaries. There was a section filled with light, and another section still drowning in darkness. The light reflected off the rocks, and the shadows moved with every flicker of the flame. The shepherd knew that the fire gave him more than warmth. It gave him a sense of safety, even if that feeling was temporary. The flock began settling down. The sheep were exhausted. They stood in small groups. Some licked their wool. Others shook their bodies, sending the snow trapped in their fur falling to the ground. The lambs searched for their mothers. Whenever they found one, they pressed themselves against her body. The damp wool released a strong smell inside the cave, the smell of animals that had spent hours in the snow. After a while, steam began rising from some of the bodies closest to the fire. The warmth was beginning to dry the outer layer of their wool. As for the dogs, they weren't ready to sleep yet. The large dog chose a place near the entrance. It lay down, then raised its head, then lowered it back to the ground. It knew its job wasn't finished. The black and white dog made one final circle around the flock. It sniffed some of the sheep, made sure everyone was there, then returned to its place. For the gray dog, it was the most restless. It continued moving around inside the cave, sniffing the ground, sniffing the rocks, sniffing the air coming from outside, then returning. The shepherd didn't pay much attention. He assumed it was simply trying to explore the new place. After the animals had settled, the shepherd sat near the fire. He removed his gloves, held his hands toward the flames. His fingers were stiff from the cold. He brought them close to the fire. He didn't place them directly over the flames. Instead, he kept them at a distance. Intense heat against severely cold fingers could be painful. He slowly moved his hands, palm, then the back of his hand, then his fingers. Little by little, sensation returned. He felt a slight tingling. The kind of tingling that comes when cold fingers begin to regain their warmth. He took out his bag. He wasn't carrying much. He pulled out a piece of bread, placed it beside him, then took out a bowl. He poured some water into it. He took out some dried herbs. They were small, curled leaves that had lost most of their color. He rubbed them lightly between his fingers, then dropped them into the water. He added a little salt. He placed the bowl over the fire, then sat and waited. At first, nothing happened. Then small bubbles began forming around the edges of the bowl. He waited longer. Steam began rising, and after a few minutes, the smell of the herbs began spreading through the cave. A simple smell. But it was warm, completely different from the smell of snow and damp wool. He took the bread, started breaking it apart with his hands. He didn't eat quickly. He knew he was facing a long night. He dipped a piece into the hot water, waited for it to soften, then ate it. The food was extremely simple, but at that moment, he didn't want anything else. He sat before the fire, chewing slowly, watching the flames. And from time to time, looking at the flock, everything seemed normal, quiet, safe. After eating, he added another piece of firewood. The flames rose. He heard a small crack. A spark flew from one end of the wood, then went out. The shepherd lifted his blanket, arranged his sleeping place near the fire. Not too close, and not too far away. He left enough space for air, then placed his bag beneath his head. He would leave the fire burning throughout the night. Not because it would remain strong until morning, but because the remaining embers could preserve some warmth inside the cave. The sheep began lying down. One, then another, then another. The way sheep sleep can seem strange to someone who doesn't know them. They don't all sleep at the same moment. There is always one awake, moving, raising its head, changing its position, then lying down. And afterward, another moves. Little by little, the entire flock began to settle. Their bodies pressed close together, the lambs in the middle, some heads lowered, their bodies close to one another. The black and white dog lay down. The gray dog rested its head on its paws, but the large dog remained near the entrance. Its eyes were half closed, but its ears were moving. A small sound outside. Its ears rose, the sound of the wind. They relaxed. Then it returned to its position. The shepherd lay down, pulled the blanket up to his shoulders. He looked at the fire. The flames moved slowly, yellow, orange, red. On the opposite wall, his shadow moved with the fire. He closed his eyes. He could hear the breathing of the flock. One sound after another. The sound of the fire, the sound of the wind, and sometimes the sound of a piece of ice falling from the top of the cave. He opened his eyes once, looked toward the entrance. Everything was normal. He closed them again. Minutes passed, then perhaps an hour. He didn't know. In the mountains, when there is no clock in front of you, time becomes something strange. 10 minutes can feel like an hour, and an entire hour can pass without you noticing. The shepherd was drifting off, opening his eyes, then drifting off again. And one time, he woke because the fire had grown weak. He sat up, took a piece of firewood, placed it over the embers, blew on it. A spark began to glow. Then the edge of the wood caught fire. The flames rose again. He looked at the animals. They were all asleep, even the dogs. He lay back down. Outside the cave, the snow continued falling. The wind passed over the entrance, moving the snow from one place to another. The footprints left by the flock when they entered had begun disappearing. In the darkness, it was no longer possible to tell where the shepherd had come from or where he could go. The cave was his entire world. The fire, the flock, the dogs, and the night. Then, just before he fell into a deep sleep, something very small happened. Something he might never have noticed if the mountain hadn't been so quiet. A faint sound, far away, a slight disturbance in the snow. The shepherd opened his eyes, raised his head, listened. He heard nothing. He looked at the large dog. It was still lying down. The shepherd breathed slowly. He told himself it was the wind, then lowered his head again and closed his eyes. But the large dog did not sleep. Its ears had risen, and it was staring at the entrance of the cave. Because the sound the shepherd had heard only once, the dog had heard it too, and perhaps it had heard something else, something that had not yet reached the shepherd's ears. Something was slowly approaching through the snow and the darkness. Night had completely settled over the mountain. There was no longer any difference between the sky and the ground. Everything outside the cave had become one mass of black and white. A dark sky, pale snow, and rocks that appeared only when touched by moonlight or illuminated by a distant flash. Inside the cave, the world was different. There was a small fire that was still burning. It was no longer as strong as it had been at the beginning of the night, but it remained alive, slowly moving across the pieces of firewood and casting a faint orange glow over the rocks. Whenever the flame moved, the shadows moved with it. For a moment, a shadow on the wall could look like a person standing there. Then it would become nothing more than a shadow again. The shepherd was asleep, or at least, he was trying to sleep. His sleep was light and interrupted, the sleep of a man accustomed to sleeping in places where he could never completely forget what was happening around him. He could hear the flock without opening his eyes, the sound of breathing, the movement of a body, a hoof scraping against the ground. Then silence. The dogs were spread out in their places. The black and white dog was lying near the sheep. The gray dog was curled up, its nose resting between its paws. But the large dog was at the entrance. It wasn't completely asleep. Its body was lying down, but its ears remained upright. Whenever the wind blew, its ears moved. And whenever a sound came from inside the flock, it ignored it. It knew the sounds of its sheep. It knew the sound of wool moving. It knew the sound of hooves. And it knew the sound of lambs when they woke up. But what it had heard moments earlier had not come from inside the cave. Minutes passed, perhaps 10 minutes, perhaps 20. Then something else happened. Crack. A very faint sound, like a foot pressing into the snow. The large dog opened its eyes completely. It raised its head. It remained perfectly still. It didn't bark. It simply listened. It raised its nose, took a long breath, then slowly released it. It smelled the air coming from outside. Then it stood up. At almost the same moment, the black and white dog woke up. It raised its head, looked at the large dog. It didn't understand anything yet, but the large dog knew that something was there. The second dog moved closer, and the two of them began staring toward the entrance. The gray dog woke a few seconds later. It raised its head, then stood. The sheep began to sense the change. One of them raised its head, looked around. It saw nothing. But it was no longer comfortable. It stood up, moved 2 steps, bumped into another sheep. The second sheep began moving, then the third. Within a few moments, part of the flock had awakened. The young lambs didn't understand what was happening, but they saw their mother standing, so they stood as well. One of the lambs made a short sound, then moved toward its mother, pressed itself against her side. The shepherd opened his eyes. At first, he didn't understand why he had woken up. His face was relatively warm from the fire, but his back was cold. He lifted his head from the bag, looked around. The flock was moving. The dogs were standing, and the fire was still burning. He slowly sat up, then looked toward the entrance. He saw nothing, only darkness. Cold air was entering through the opening. The flame flickered slightly, and the darkness outside the cave seemed deeper than ever. He said quietly, "What's wrong?" The dogs didn't answer. The large dog was still standing. Its eyes were fixed on the entrance. Then the sound came. This time it was clearer. Crack. The shepherd froze. He didn't move. He looked at the dogs. The large dog let out a very low growl, a sound barely audible. But the shepherd knew this sound. It wasn't a playful growl, and it wasn't an ordinary warning. It was the growl of an animal sensing that something unfamiliar was nearby. The shepherd reached for his staff. It was lying beside him. He felt the cold wood in his hand. He looked toward the entrance, then at the flock. The sheep began moving closer together. Under normal circumstances, the flock would have spread throughout the cave. Some sheep would lie here, others there. But now, they began moving toward the center. Their bodies became closer, wool touching wool, shoulders pressed together, and the lambs disappeared between the larger bodies. The animals were doing what sheep do when they sense danger or extreme cold. They move closer to one another, not because they know what is waiting for them, but because having others beside them gives them a sense of safety. And there was another reason: heat. Each body retained some of its warmth, and when the animals pressed together, less heat was lost. So the flock slowly became one tightly packed mass. The shepherd remained silent. He was trying to explain the sound. Perhaps a wolf, perhaps more than one wolf, perhaps a wild animal that had lost its way. But something didn't make sense. He hadn't heard a howl. He hadn't heard barking outside. He hadn't heard the breathing of an animal, not even the sound of multiple footsteps. There was only one thing: footsteps. One step at a time. He waited. Long seconds passed. Then, crack, a step. This time, it was closer. The large dog raised its head higher. The hair along its back began to rise slightly. The black and white dog moved toward it, but the gray dog stepped back half a step. It was the smallest of them, and for the first time that night, it looked afraid. The shepherd noticed, and he didn't like seeing fear in the dog's eyes. Dogs don't frighten easily, especially dogs that have spent years in the mountains. If it was afraid, there was probably a reason. The shepherd added another piece of firewood to the fire. He didn't want the flames to go out. The wood slowly caught fire. Then the flames rose. The light became stronger. He looked toward the entrance of the cave, but the light reached only a few meters outside. Beyond that, nothing. Darkness. He reached for the lantern, lit it. Now he had a small source of light in his hand. He stood, hesitated for a moment, then took one step forward. The sheep stopped moving, as if they were watching him. The dogs moved with him, but the large dog remained in front. The shepherd did not move past it. He knew that walking out into the darkness and snow without knowing what was outside was a bad idea, so he stopped. Then he heard something else. Not a step, but a scraping sound. Shh, as if something were moving across the layer of snow. Then it stopped. The shepherd held his breath. The dogs raised their heads. The flock froze. There was no movement, no sound. Even the wind seemed to stop for a moment. And the silence at that moment was more terrifying than any sound, because the silence allowed the shepherd to hear his own heart. Fast, clear. Then he could hear the dogs breathing, then the sheep breathing, then the small crackle of the fire. Everything was suddenly so clear. The shepherd thought about wolves. He knew they could approach silently, but a wolf didn't usually come alone. And if there was a pack, why couldn't he hear anything? Maybe they were far away. Maybe they were watching. Maybe they were waiting for an opportunity. He looked at the sheep. If wolves were really outside the cave, sleep would be impossible. But something inside him said the sound was different. It sounded more like human footsteps. One step, then a pause. One step, then a pause. As if whatever was outside was walking carefully. A minute passed, then two. Nothing happened. The shepherd began to think it was over. Perhaps a rock had shifted because of the snow. Perhaps part of the mountain had collapsed. Perhaps it was the wind. He sat back down, placed the staff beside him. But he didn't turn off the lantern. Then the step came. Crack. Closer. This time there was no doubt. It was a foot. Something was walking across the snow. The shepherd stood again, raised the lantern. The large dog moved forward until it reached the edge of the entrance. It stood there. It didn't bark. It didn't charge. It simply fixed its eyes on the darkness. Then it opened its mouth slightly and released a low growl, deeper than before. The shepherd stopped behind it, raised the lantern. His hand tightened around the handle. He felt coldness in his fingers, not only because of the air. His entire body was on alert. The footsteps continued, but they weren't fast. They were extremely slow. One step, then a pause. Another step, then a pause. As if the animal outside was stopping to listen as well. And that made everything even stranger, because the shepherd began to feel that both sides were doing the same thing. He was listening to it, and it was listening to them. One of the sheep suddenly moved. It jumped backward, bumped into another sheep, let out a sharp sound. The tension spread through the flock. Some sheep began moving quickly, but they didn't know where to go. The place was enclosed, and going outside meant facing whatever was out there, so they all moved back toward one another. Their bodies pressed closer. The lambs moved into the center. The warmth between their bodies increased slightly, but fear was stronger than warmth. Then, silence. There was nothing anymore. No footsteps, no wind, no sound. Even the dogs stopped making noises. The shepherd waited. A long time passed. Then he began to think. Maybe it had left. Maybe it was just a passing animal. Maybe it wasn't looking for them at all. But before he could finish the thought, he heard it. This time, it was very close. Crack, then a second step. Crack, then a third. Crack. The sound was no longer far away. It was almost at the entrance. The shepherd took one step forward, raised the lantern. The large dog moved toward the outside. It extended its head slightly, then stopped. Suddenly, it froze in place. It didn't move. The shepherd saw something change in its expression. It was no longer a growl. It was no longer fear. It looked more like confusion, as if the dog itself didn't know what it was looking at. The shepherd raised the lantern higher, but the fog was thick. Only part of the ground was visible. Then something white appeared in the distance. At first, he thought it was a rock. Then it moved. The shepherd froze. There was something standing in the snow, something alive. The shadow approached, slowly. One step, then it stopped. Another step, then it stopped. The light was very weak, but the shepherd began to see a shape. Legs, a body, a lowered head, something covered in snow. It wasn't a wolf. It was larger than that. And it wasn't a human. It walked differently. It came closer. The large dog began to step backward, not running away, but slowly retreating, as if it were trying to make way. The shepherd didn't understand. He raised the lantern again, and the creature was now only a few steps away from the cave. There was a strange moment, a moment when neither side made a sound. The shepherd stood still. The dogs stood still. The sheep were silent, and the creature stood outside, facing them. Only the snow was moving. The wind passed around its body. Snow melted across its back, then froze again. It was thin, emaciated. Its wool was long and tangled. Some of it was stuck against its body. Some of it was covered in a layer of ice. But the shepherd couldn't see its face clearly. The animal lowered its head, then raised it, looked toward the flock, then looked at the shepherd, and remained standing. At that moment, something happened that the shepherd never expected. The large dog didn't bark. It didn't attack. It didn't growl. Instead, it slowly began wagging its tail. Once, then it stopped. The shepherd looked at it, then turned his eyes back to the animal. He began to feel something strange. Something about the shape of the head, the way it stood, the way it moved. There was something familiar, something he had seen before, but his mind wasn't ready to believe it yet. The animal took another step closer, raised its head, opened its mouth, and in the middle of that night, Only one sound came out. A simple sound. Quiet. But it was enough to change everything. Bah. The sound lingered in the entrance of the cave, only 1 second, but to the shepherd, it seemed longer than the entire night. He didn't move. He barely breathed. His eyes were fixed on the white body standing in the snow. Then the animal made the sound again. Bah. At that moment, the shepherd felt something collapse inside him. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't simply surprise. It was something deeper, something between astonishment, longing, and shock. He lowered the lantern slightly, then raised it again. He looked at the face, at the ears, at the shape of the head, at the small mark near the eye. Then he looked at one of its legs. There was a slight bend in the way it stood, a mark he could never have forgotten. The shepherd took a step backward and whispered, "Impossible." The only answer was the wind. The animal came closer. One step, then another. It was walking with difficulty. Each step sank into the snow. It lifted one foot, planted it, then dragged the other forward. It was clearly weak, frighteningly thin, but the closer it came, the clearer its features became. And then there was no longer any room for doubt. It was her, the same sheep, the sheep that had disappeared a year ago, the sheep he had searched for, the sheep he had believed was dead, the sheep he thought the wolves had eaten or the snow had buried. She was standing in front of him, alive, after an entire year. The shepherd didn't know what to do. He simply stared at her. Then he looked at the dogs. The large dog slowly approached her. It smelled her face, then smelled the side of her body. It stopped for a moment, then began wagging its tail. The black and white dog came closer. It smelled her too. Suddenly, its movements changed. It began walking around her, then moved even closer, as if it were trying to make sure. The gray dog remained slightly farther away. It looked at her, then looked at the shepherd, as if it couldn't understand what was happening. The sheep herself didn't seem afraid of the dogs. Quite the opposite. She lowered her head, moved toward the large dog, then touched her nose to his, and at that moment, the shepherd knew it was real. It wasn't an animal that merely looked like her. It wasn't a dream, and it wasn't the effect of exhaustion and cold. It was the sheep he had lost a year earlier, the same one. The shepherd approached her, slowly, one step, then another. The animal didn't move. He reached out his hand, touched her head. Her wool was cold, extremely cold, covered in snow, but beneath the wool was a living body. The shepherd trembled. He ran his hand along her neck, then across her face, and without realizing it, his eyes began to fill with tears. He said in a broken voice, "Where have you been?" Of course, she didn't answer. She simply raised her head, then let out a faint bleat. Bah! As if she knew him. For several moments, the shepherd was unable to comprehend what had happened. His mind was trying to find an explanation. How could a sheep survive an entire year in these mountains? How had she survived the winter? How had she found food? How had she survived the wolves? Where had she been? And why had she appeared now? There were too many questions, but there was no time to answer them. The sheep was weak, and the night outside was freezing. She needed to enter the cave. He gestured toward her with his hand, then began moving inside. She hesitated for a moment, then followed him. She entered the cave, and suddenly, the other sheep began to move. They raised their heads. Some of them came closer, and the flock began surrounding her. The sheep that had returned from the mountain was now in the middle of the flock, as if she wasn't a stranger, as if she had returned home. One of the sheep approached her, smelled her, then moved away. Another approached, then a third. After a few minutes, the animals began settling around her. The lambs watched her curiously. As for the sheep herself, she stood in the middle, exhausted, hungry, but safe. The shepherd sat nearby. He took a piece of bread, then remembered that sheep don't eat bread that way. He smiled for the first time in hours. He took some of the food he was carrying, placed it in front of her. She began eating slowly, a small bite. Then she stopped, then another bite. The shepherd watched her. He was afraid she might suddenly disappear, that he might wake up and discover that everything that had happened was only a dream. He sat beside the fire throughout the night. He no longer felt sleepy. Whenever he tried to close his eyes, he opened them again, looked at her. She was still there, alive, breathing, eating, and sometimes sleeping. He added a piece of firewood whenever the flames began to weaken. He didn't want the cave to grow cold. He watched the sheep, watched the flock, and watched the dogs. The large dog lay down beside her and rested his head next to her body, as if the two of them had known each other only yesterday. As the night passed, the animals slowly became tired again. The sheep lay down one after another. The lambs hid among their mothers. Even the sheep that had returned from the mountain finally lay down. She placed her head on the ground and closed her eyes. But the shepherd remained awake. He looked at her, then at the fire, then at the entrance of the cave, and there was one question in his mind. How? How had she managed to survive an entire year? Just before sunrise, the storm began to weaken. The wind became lighter, and the snow almost stopped. A gray light entered through the entrance of the cave. The shepherd opened his eyes. He had fallen asleep without realizing it. He looked around. The first thing he searched for was the sheep. He found her. She was lying among the flock, alive. Only then did he smile. The shepherd left the cave after sunrise. The air was still bitterly cold, but the sky was beginning to clear. A faint blue appeared behind the clouds, and the mountains began to emerge again. White peaks, black rocks, deep slopes. Everything looked different in the morning light. The shepherd stood at the entrance of the cave. He looked toward the place where the sheep had appeared during the night. There were no clear tracks. The snow had covered them, but one thing was clear to him. She had come from somewhere, and she had lived there for an entire year. He began gathering the flock. He called to them with his voice. The sheep moved slowly. The dogs woke up. The large dog began moving around the flock, and the returning sheep stood with difficulty. She hesitated for a moment, then walked. The shepherd watched her. Her steps were slow, but she was walking, and that was enough. They began descending the mountain. This time, the shepherd walked behind the flock more than usual. He wanted to watch the sheep. Every few minutes, he looked at her. Was she still walking? Was she getting tired? Was she falling? Did she need help? And every time, she continued. Sometimes she stumbled, then got back up. She stopped, then continued, as if she knew the way. When they reached the area where she had disappeared a year earlier, The shepherd stopped. He looked at the rocks. The flock stopped too. It was the same place, the same slope, the same rocks, but something had changed. The shepherd no longer looked at the place like a grave. Instead, it felt like the beginning of a story whose ending he didn't know. He approached the edge, looked down. There were deep cracks between the rocks, and among them were signs of a narrow passage extending behind the slope. A passage he hadn't noticed a year earlier. He moved closer. Then he understood something. Perhaps when the sheep fell, she hadn't fallen to her death. Perhaps she had rolled into that passage, and perhaps she had found a place behind the rocks, sheltered from the wind, a place where there was some grass and water from melting snow, a place where an animal could hide. But one question remained. How had she survived the entire winter? There was no answer, and perhaps there never would be a complete answer. Mountains keep their secrets, and the shepherd knew that better than anyone. But there was one thing he no longer doubted. The sheep had not died. She had survived in a way he didn't understand, and she had remained in the mountains until the next winter came. Until the shepherd returned to the same place, and until the wind carried the sound of her footsteps toward the cave. The flock began descending. The closer they got to the village, the easier the road became. Less snow, warmer air, more stable ground. And after several hours, the houses appeared. The villagers had begun coming outside. They saw the shepherd, they saw the flock. Then one of them noticed something, a sheep walking among them. The man stopped, looked at her, then said, "Wait." He moved closer, stared at her face. Then his expression changed. He called the others. People began coming out of their homes, one after another. No one could believe what they were seeing. The sheep that had disappeared a year ago had returned. One of the men approached her, then another. They all knew her story. They remembered the day the shepherd had returned without her. They remembered searching for her, and they remembered the storm that came afterward. Some believed she had died. Some said the wolves had taken her. Others said the mountain had swallowed her. But she was now standing in front of them, alive, thin, exhausted, and covered with the traces of an entire year spent surviving in the mountains. The shepherd didn't know what to say. He simply stood there, looking at the sheep, then at the people, then back at her. He approached her, placed his hand on her head, and said, "You came back." This time, his voice was different. It wasn't the voice of a shepherd speaking to an animal. It was the voice of someone welcoming back something he had believed was lost forever. And from that day on, the sheep was no longer just another sheep in the flock. She became a story. Whenever winter came, the villagers talked about her, about the sheep that disappeared into the mountain, about the year when no one knew where she had gone, and about the night she appeared at the entrance of the cave. But one question remained, the question no one could answer. What happened to that sheep throughout the entire year? Did she live alone among the rocks? Did she find a hidden shelter inside the mountain? Did she survive on the grass that remained beneath the snow? And how did she find her way back? No one knew, and the shepherd himself never claimed to know. He would only say, "I lost her there." Then he would look at the mountain, and she came back to me from there. And every winter after that, whenever the shepherd climbed into the mountains, he would sometimes stop at the cave. He would look at its entrance, light a small fire, and sit there for a few moments, Not because he was waiting for something to return, but because he remembered that night. The night when he, the flock, and the dogs were alone in the heart of the mountain. The night when they heard footsteps approaching through the darkness. The night when he thought the wolves had come. Then something appeared that was never supposed to be there. A sheep he had lost a year earlier, alive, standing in the snow, waiting for him to recognize her. And ever since that time, whenever the shepherd heard footsteps in the snow at night, he would stop and listen carefully, because the mountain had taught him one thing: not everything that disappears dies. And sometimes what we believe has ended forever returns to us from the very place where we lost it.